For the purpose of this film, we will introduce you to the historical background of Thaba Nchu, where it is and how it came to be what it is today. We will then move on to the two conceptual and philosophical frameworks that we are using to interpret the event space of Thaba Nchu.
What shapes our environment? In complex historical influences, on the one hand, establishes parameters that define space, establish boundaries, shape the collective memory. But on the other hand, the environment is constantly in a state of flux, changing every day. Many disciplines are consciously involved in this process, but the user who forms part of the environment unconsciously contributes daily to the environmental poiesis. Proximities of structures that make up the fabric of towns and cities are joined together by what happens between buildings. The generic makeup of a town or a city is engraved in our minds, and variations of what constitutes that makeup we find in various parts of the world. But how do we interpret space as an urban geographer or architect, or any discipline for that matter, without being prejudiced as to how public space or shared space is to be used? Our involvement or interpretation in any situation is based on subjective prejudice.
And with this in mind, we will look at the historical background of Thaba Nchu. The human settlement and geographical space known as Thaba Nchu in the Free State province of South Africa is an early 19th century settlement occupied by a group of Batswana called Barolongbo Selek. The Southern African society broke away from the dominant Barolongbo Ratsidi in Mahikeng, northwest province of South Africa in the late 18th century. They migrated southwards from Mahikeng region for at least 10 days by foot with two English missionaries to the Basotho territory under Chief Moshweshwe, who gave them an uninhabited tract of land for them to occupy and reorganize. By the 1830s, the social group of the Barolong were soon joined by the Voortrekkers of Hendrik Potgieter after evading British troops who evicted them from the Cape and drove them northwards to inland South African territory. Without much food, water, shelter, and weapons for the Dutch Afrikaner settler migrants, Chief Moshweshwe, along with Chief Moraka of the Barolong, allocated the settler migrants land and other resources to recuperate from British onslaught in their struggle for territorial and political autonomy. Without delving much into the well-documented history and political geography of Thaba Nchu prior and during colonization and then later apartheid, it is important to note that the pre-colonial landscape was composed of a network of villages that sprouted at the base of the society's iconic mountain. The urban geographical map shows an interconnected network of 35 dispersed villages making up Thaba Nchu.
As regards to Thaba Nchu's urban morphology, haptic town planning, as opposed to the grid layout of axis and hierarchy, speaks to the juxtaposition of Western and African influences, basically shared space as opposed to individual space. As an outsider moving into Thaba Nchu, one would clearly see the derelict and dire situation of the context. Abandoned industrial buildings and abandoned houses being in neglect and left in decay. These processes of abandonment and urban vacancy are also experienced in other cities, like for instance Detroit in the US. But with this said, as you move into the town center, one clearly identifies that there is another system, a different system that was established above the existing juxtaposed influences. Up to this point, there has been little conceptual and empirical work done by contemporary architects and urban geographers in Thaba Nchu. This to analyze the contemporary landscape and society and to offer alternative views on the different and complex ways in which current inhabitants infer and ascribe meaning to the everyday architectural and planned geographical landscape they experience. Now, it's the purpose of the authors, an architect and a Lefebvrean urban geographer, to explore this unchecked complexity of space making in Thaba Nchu and the spatial analysis of Thaba Nchu's multifaceted spatial practices in the contemporary city. This multi- or trans-interdisciplinary investigation aims to establish a method for spatial analysis in the post-industrial global south.
Everywhere where a place, a time, and expenditure of energy interact, there is rhythm. Rhythm is produced and experienced when energy-producing human bodies are deployed in a space, act and interact in it within a particular time, thus affecting its meaning, representation, and spatial practice, that is, its economic and material production and social reproduction. When space is evoked, we must immediately say what occupies that space and how it continues to do so. When time is evoked, we must say what changes therein, and likewise energy. It must always be noted as deployed in space. Heidegger concurs with this assertion, stating that the incorporation of time, whether as history, prehistory, the present, and/or the future, implies location or geography and motion, energy, movement, flows within a spatial network. This motion, however, becomes rhythm when seasons, music, repetition or routine, and cosmic time is taken into consideration. In an effort to contextualize this rhythm analysis in our social spatial interpretation of Thaba Nchu, Lefebvre's three-dimensional spatial triad of representations of space, spatial practice, and representational space is introduced. Representations of space or conceived space is the conceptualized space of planners, architects, urbanists, social engineers, technocratic subdividers, politicians, and the special type of artist with a scientific bent. This space is the built environment and planned space of Thaba Nchu. Spatial practice or perceived space is first lived directly before it was conceptualized. This is the real-time interaction between conceived space, the built environment, and the lived space in motion or in its beingness in the world. Representational space or lived space is the physical space that is directly lived or experienced by ordinary users and inhabitants. This is the dominated space of users and inhabitants that the conceived space always seeks to physically change and to appropriate. In representational space, it is where we find meaning and subjective interpretation. So, in representational space, that is where meaning and subjective interpretation is derived and inferred, and in most cases, contested. In the case of Thaba Nchu, the street layout and the arrangement of buildings, green public spaces, and transportation networks in the urban space are the conceived space. Their uses by ordinary inhabitants and users are in dialectical opposition to their conceived production. For example, in Thaba Nchu streets and buildings, informal sector activities are discharged in the conceived spaces by inhabitants who overlay themselves over designed spaces. Consumable goods like fresh fruits and vegetables, clothing and shoes are constantly bought and sold, supplied and demanded. In other words, they constantly circulate in the public streets of Thaba Nchu. Commodities in motion. The circulation of everyday economic goods occurs alongside static banking, retail and wholesale, commercial and public transportation services, and to some extent, service providers who operate within the abstract realm of architecture and planning. In terms of their general spatial practice, this refers to or speaks to their geographical representation and/or rhythm as perceived by a Lefebvrean analyst of African bent. In their Western form, Thaba Nchu streets, commercial and public transportation districts are designed spaces that must order the urban landscape and organize its social functions by facilitating the relative flow and circulation of human and non-human traffic. They are not, as a result, in their Western form, not designed to support the autonomous and therefore informal economic and social practices of Thaba Nchu. We therefore ask, how is the inherent tension or social spatial contradictions between the lived and the conceived spaces as described by Lefebvre's spatial triad expressed in Thaba Nchu? Are they antagonistic only, or are they in dialectical harmony given the hybrid nature of Thaba Nchu's mutating urban landscape? We use Lefebvre's rhythm analytical spatial triad alongside Gadamer's hermeneutics to construct knowledge about the analytical complexities of interpreting urban space and society's relationship to that urban built environment in Thaba Nchu. Through hermeneutics, the interpreter or analyst's role is elevated in a way that Lefebvre envisions as well for his spatial triadic rhythm analyst. The perceiving analyst is instrumental in the process of spatial interpretation and representation. As a result, the analyst must necessarily engage in the process of critiquing and being critical of the subjective biases. For this work, we use Lefebvre's rhythm analytical spatial triad and Gadamer's hermeneutics to interpret Thaba Nchu's built environment and society. This in an effort to understand the social reproduction and meanings alongside representations of this non-static post-industrial urban space in the ideological and geographical global south.
The question as to the method for analyzing public space in a young democratic South Africa requires the interpreter to allow him or herself to be part of what Heidegger terms the unconcealment or concealment of truth. 20 years of democracy, searching for identity, and the need to accommodate a multicultural society. For this complex task, we might have to take a step back and ask the interpreter, before ascribing meaning to spatial analysis and ultimately architectural interventions, to allow themselves to gain tacit knowledge through what is being perceived, and to conceal certain personal truths, and to allow contextual truths to be unconcealed. This requires a humble approach that cannot be achieved without the shared information of inter or transdisciplinary disciplines. Thank you for your participation in this presentation, and we aim to address many of these themes in the article to follow.